for him, it's a pity he missed it because he would have had a good time. You know, and it was nice to see people saying, well, after all that we've done, you know, it's all it was, really. Get the lads here, give them a pat on the back and give them the medal.
After decades of quiet reflection and carefully chosen words, Paul McCartney has finally broken his silence about George Harrison, and what he reveals is both deeply emotional and unexpectedly revealing. Behind the music, the fame, and the legendary success of the Beatles, there existed a complex friendship shaped by admiration, tension, and unspoken truths. Now, long after the spotlight faded, McCartney is opening up like never before. What really happened between them? And why has it taken so long for these powerful insights to come to light at last? The realization that came too late. Years after the noise of fame had faded and the urgency of success no longer dictated every decision, Paul McCartney began to speak with a different kind of honesty. In interviews and quiet reflections, his tone carried something that had not been there before. It was not just memory. It was recognition. Looking back, he admitted that he had not always seen George Harrison clearly for who he truly was. At the time, he believed he was guiding the band, shaping its direction, pushing it toward greatness. But with distance came a sharper understanding. What felt like leadership then now appeared more complicated, more uneven. In those early years in Liverpool, their connection had formed naturally, almost effortlessly. Paul was older, more confident, already stepping into music with a sense of purpose. George was younger, quieter, still finding his footing in a world that did not always make space for him. Paul noticed his dedication quickly. He saw the discipline, the hours of practice, the hunger to improve, and in many ways, he became a bridge, helping George move closer to the center of something that was still taking shape. It felt like support. It felt like belief. But beneath that support, something else was quietly forming. The difference in age, experience, and confidence created a subtle imbalance that would grow over time. Paul was not just encouraging George. He was also, without fully realizing it, defining the space George could occupy. Decisions came faster from him. Ideas carried more weight. Direction often followed his instinct. At first, it did not seem like a problem. The music was working. The band was moving forward. Everything appeared aligned. Yet what Paul understands now is that clarity did not exist back then. He did not see how easily guidance could become control, or how quickly admiration could turn into limitation. George was not just learning, he was evolving. And while Paul continued to push forward with certainty, George was beginning to look for something more, something beyond simply following. Those reflections carry a quiet tension that is difficult to ignore. It is not because they attempt to change what already happened, but because they expose what went unnoticed in the moment. Looking back, Paul McCartney begins to see more than just the music they created together. He recognizes something deeper in George Harrison, not only his talent, but his need for space, for trust, and for the freedom to grow without limits. At the time, that need was often overshadowed by direction, structure, and the urgency to succeed. What felt necessary then now appears incomplete. Paul understands that it was not simply about songs or contributions, but about presence, about being fully seen and heard. That space, once missed, cannot be returned to. And in that awareness, there remains a truth that does not settle easily, something that continues to follow the story as it unfolds. Buried within Paul McCartney's reflections is a quiet tension that refuses to fade, not from what was said, but from what was missed. Did he only realize George Harrison's true worth when the space he needed had already disappeared forever? Let's find out. When direction turned into distance. As those early imbalances quietly deepened, the difference in perspective between Paul McCartney and George Harrison began to show in ways that could no longer be ignored. What Paul saw as focus and creative drive, George increasingly experienced as limitation. The music was evolving, becoming more ambitious and experimental, but within that evolution, the space for George's voice began to narrow. By 1966 and into 1967, the pressure surrounding the Beatles had reached a level few could fully understand. They were no longer just a band from Liverpool. They were shaping the future of music itself. In that environment, Paul naturally stepped forward, taking control in the studio, guiding arrangements, refining ideas, and pushing for perfection. His influence was undeniable, especially during the creation of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, a project that carried his vision from beginning to end. To Paul, this was progress. It was the sound of a band reaching its highest potential. For George, however, that same process felt isolating. His contribution to the album, Within You, Without You, stood apart from everything else. Deeply rooted in Indian philosophy and spiritual exploration, it reflected a side of him that had grown far beyond the boundaries of traditional pop music. But instead of being fully integrated into the band's direction, it remained separate, almost like a window into a different world that few around him fully understood. What Paul saw as just another track within a larger concept, George experienced as something far more personal, something that defined who he was becoming. This divide became even clearer during the Beatles' trip to India in 1968. For George, the journey was not a temporary escape or a creative break. It was a turning point. Immersed in meditation and spiritual study, he began to see life and music through a completely different lens. Paul approached it with curiosity, but also with a sense of detachment, treating it as an experience rather than a transformation. That difference in meaning created a quiet but powerful tension. Conversations that once flowed easily now carried an undercurrent of misunderstanding. Paul believed he was pushing the band forward, keeping it sharp, disciplined, and innovative. George, on the other hand, felt that something essential was being overlooked. His ideas were no longer just musical suggestions. They were expressions of identity, shaped by a deeper search for purpose. And yet, time and again, they seemed to be placed on the edges rather than at the center. What had once been a shared journey was beginning to split into separate paths. The music continued, the success grew, but beneath it all, a silence was forming, one that would soon become impossible to ignore. Conversations became shorter, meanings became harder to express, and the space between them quietly widened. To the world, everything still looked perfect, but behind the scenes, something fragile was slowly slipping away, unnoticed at first, until the distance could no longer be hidden. As Paul tightened control to drive perfection, George drifted further from the center, his voice reduced to the margins of a band he helped shape. Was this relentless push for greatness the very force that quietly fractured everything they once built together? Stay with us. The day silence turned into consequence. The distance that had been quietly building finally reached a point where it could no longer be contained. By 1969, the tension inside the Beatles was no longer hidden beneath music or success. It was visible, recorded, and impossible to ignore. During the Let It Be sessions, cameras captured not just a band at work, but a relationship under strain, especially between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Paul remained focused on structure and direction. He pushed for precision, guiding rehearsals and shaping how each part should sound. To him, this was necessary. The band needed discipline to move forward, but for George, the experience had become suffocating. The space that once allowed him to grow now felt tightly controlled. His frustration, built over years of being overlooked, surfaced in a moment that would define everything that followed. During one rehearsal, George responded to Paul with words that carried more than just irritation. He said he would play whatever Paul wanted him to play, or he would not play at all, if that was preferred. It was not simply a remark. It was a reflection of everything he had been holding back. The calm delivery only made it more powerful. It exposed how deeply he felt restricted, how little room he believed he had left to express himself within the band. Not long after, on January 10, 1969, George made a decision that sent shock through the group. He walked out. Unlike earlier threats from others, this was not talk. It was action. He later described the environment as unhealthy and unhappy, a place he could no longer remain in without losing something important within himself. For the others, including Paul, the reality of his absence was immediate. George was not just a guitarist. He was a vital part of the balance that held everything together. He returned 12 days later, but the meaning of that departure did not disappear. It stayed beneath every conversation, every recording session, every attempt to move forward. Around the same time, George had already been building a strong collection of songs, including All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill. Many of these had been set aside during Beatles sessions, reinforcing his belief that his work was not being fully valued. In a private conversation later captured by writer Peter Brown, Paul admitted to John Lennon that George's songs had reached a level equal to theirs. It was a significant acknowledgement, one that suggested a shift in perspective. But it came quietly, away from George, and long after the damage had already taken shape. What Paul did not say in the moment became part of what followed. The realization was there, but the response was missing. And in that silence, something essential between them began to slip further out of reach. Behind closed doors, Paul McCartney admitted George Harrison had reached their level, yet those words never reached George when they mattered most. If the truth was known but never spoken, did silence quietly fracture something that could have changed everything forever? Keep watching. When triumph could not heal the divide. Even after the shock of 1969, the music did not collapse. In fact, it reached one of its highest points. As the Beatles moved into recording Abbey Road, there was a sense of professionalism that masked the deeper fractures beneath the surface. For George Harrison, this period became a long-awaited moment of recognition. After years of being pushed to the margins, his voice finally stood at the center. He delivered two of the album's most celebrated songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Both carried a clarity and emotional depth that could not be overlooked. Something in particular drew admiration far beyond the band. Frank Sinatra would later describe it as one of the greatest love songs ever written, while John Lennon openly acknowledged its strength within the album itself. For George, it was more than success. It was proof that what he had been building over the years had always been there, waiting to be heard. For Paul McCartney, the shift was unmistakable. George was no longer the quiet contributor working in the background. He had become a creative force in his own right. Yet even as the music reached new heights, the relationship between them did not fully recover. The respect was there in moments, but the ease that once defined their connection remained out of reach. Conversations were careful, interactions stayed professional. Beneath it all, the earlier tensions continued to shape how they worked together. When the Beatles officially came to an end in 1970, both men stepped into separate paths. George moved quickly, releasing All Things Must Pass, a triple album that revealed the depth of material he had been holding back. Songs like Run of the Mill carried traces of the emotional strain he had experienced, including lines that hinted at the loss of friendship. It was not just an artistic statement. It was personal. During the 1970s, the distance between them became more visible. George spoke openly about his frustrations, describing Paul as overpowering and difficult to work with. He even suggested that he would consider playing in a band again with John Lennon, but not with Paul. For Paul, these remarks did not go unnoticed. While he maintained a composed public image, the impact lingered privately. There were opportunities to bridge the gap. In 1971, George organized the Concert for Bangladesh and invited Paul to take part. Paul declined, citing logistical concerns. The absence added another layer to the growing separation, reinforcing the sense that even shared history was no longer enough to bring them together. George had proven himself beyond doubt. His songs, his vision, and his voice had found their place in the world. Yet the distance between him and Paul remained, shaped not by a lack of success, but by something far more difficult to repair. An invitation meant to heal arrived in 1971, yet Paul McCartney stayed away, and the silence only deepened. George Harrison had nothing left to prove, so why did the distance remain, untouched by success, unbroken by time, and impossible to repair even then? Stay glued. When time brought them back but not together. Years passed, and the sharp edges of the past began to soften, at least on the surface. By the early 1990s, circumstances created a moment that few believed would ever happen again. On February 11, 1994, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr reunited at Paul's studio to work on unfinished demos left behind by John Lennon. The world would come to know them as the Threedles. For fans, it felt like something lost had returned. For those inside the room, it was more complicated. From the beginning, George approached the sessions with caution. He had not forgotten the dynamics that once defined their work together. Before recording even began, he made one thing clear: the project needed an outside producer. He insisted that Jeff Lynne take on that role, warning that without someone to guide the process, old patterns could quickly resurface. Paul later recalled George's concern, acknowledging that without structure, their strong personalities could clash once again. As work progressed on songs like Free as a Bird and Real Love, those differences became visible. Paul wanted to recreate the essence of the Beatles, shaping the music in a way that felt familiar and complete. George, however, leaned toward simplicity. He resisted anything that felt overly controlled or polished, preferring a more natural and restrained approach. Even small details became points of disagreement. Guitar parts, arrangements, and overall direction carried echoes of the past. Despite this, the music was completed. The song stood as a bridge between what had been and what remained. Yet behind that achievement, the emotional distance never fully disappeared. The collaboration worked, but it did not erase the years that had come before it. Outside the studio, something else began to shift. Paul started to speak more openly about George's abilities. In interviews, he admitted that he had once underestimated him. He described George as a late bloomer, someone who had grown into a songwriter capable of creating some of the most powerful music of their time. It was a significant acknowledgement, one that reflected a deeper understanding of what George had always been capable of. But that recognition arrived long after the moments when it might have made a difference. The respect was now clear, the appreciation openly expressed, yet it existed in a space shaped by history. What had once been overlooked could now be seen, but it could not be relived. Long after the music had defined a generation, Paul McCartney began admitting a truth he once overlooked: George's genius. But why did that recognition come only after everything had changed? Stay tuned. What remained when everything fell silent? As the years moved forward, time began to change the rhythm of everything. The distance that once defined the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison no longer came from creative differences or unspoken frustrations. It came from something far more final. By the late 1990s, George's health had begun to decline. In 1997, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, a condition that forced him into a quieter and more private life. Treatment followed, but the challenges did not end there. He later faced lung cancer and eventually a brain tumor, each diagnosis narrowing the space in which he could live and create. In 1999, a violent attack at his home in Friar Park left him physically weakened, adding another layer to an already fragile condition. Through it all, George remained grounded in his beliefs, holding on to the spiritual perspective that had guided him for years. For Paul, these developments brought a shift that was impossible to ignore. The past, with all its disagreements and distance, began to feel smaller in comparison to what was now unfolding. There were moments when they came together again, not as rivals or collaborators, but as two people who had shared a lifetime. One of the most significant came during George's final period in New York. Paul visited him in the hospital, sitting by his side for hours. The atmosphere was not heavy with regret in the way one might expect. Instead, there were flashes of something familiar. They laughed about simple things, spoke in ways that echoed their younger days, and for a brief moment, the years between them seemed to fade. At one point, they held hands. It was a small gesture, but one that carried deep meaning. In their youth, Such openness would have felt out of place, shaped by the culture they had grown up in. Now, it required no explanation. It simply existed, quiet and honest. Later, Paul would describe George with words that revealed how he truly saw him. He called him his little baby brother, a phrase that carried both affection and a recognition of what had always been there beneath everything else. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away at the age of 58. His ashes were scattered in the waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in line with his spiritual beliefs. The loss was not just personal. It marked the end of a connection that had begun long before fame, before pressure, before everything that had complicated it. In the years that followed, Paul found quiet ways to hold on to that connection. A tree that George had once given him stood near his home. Each time he passed it, he would greet it softly, saying, "Hi, George." It was a simple act, but one filled with meaning, a reminder that what had been shared could not be erased, even if not everything had been said when it mattered most. So, what do you think? Did Paul McCartney truly break his silence about George Harrison, or did clarity arrive only after loss, when nothing could be changed? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.